There was once a man who stood behind the pulpit every Sunday, Bible in hand, words flowing effortlessly. He was well-spoken, charismatic, and knew how to hold an audience. His sermons were crafted with precision, full of clever illustrations and polished delivery. People nodded their heads, amened in the right places, and left feeling good about themselves. But there was one problem. He never prayed. Oh, he said prayers, before meals, before bed, before service, but he never truly prayed. He never spent himself before God on behalf of his people. He never wept for their souls. He never fasted, never wrestled in the secret place, and never cried out for heaven to break through. Yet Scripture is clear. Prayer and fasting are inseparable weapons in the hands of those who seek God's move. In the book of Joel, chapter 2, the Lord calls his people to a holy fast. Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly. Here, the trumpet is the shofar, a ram's horn used to announce sacred times and signal the year of Jubilee, or Yovel. In Leviticus 25, the shofar's blast on the Day of Atonement proclaimed liberty throughout the land, inaugurating a season of freedom, restoration, and forgiveness. The term Jubilee, Yovel, itself means ram's horn, signifying both the instrument and the event it heralds. Likewise, when Jesus opened his public ministry in Luke chapter 4, he read from the scroll of Isaiah, declaring, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Here, Jesus was announcing the ultimate Jubilee, fulfilling Isaiah 61, a passage saturated in Jubilee language. The word for proclaim in this context is kara, meaning to call out, recite, or announce publicly, just as the shofar is sounded to gather the assembly and declare God's appointed times. When we fast, as commanded in Joel 2, we are not just denying ourselves, we are, in the Spirit, blowing the shofar, heralding the good news that the captives can go free. Fasting becomes a spiritual proclamation, a kara, signaling God's intervention and mercy for our land. Isaiah 58, often called the fasting chapter, is Jubilee language from start to finish. The acceptable, ratzon, fast is not merely an abstention from food, but a breaking of chains, a loosing of bonds, and a time of release. The word ratzon means favor, delight, or pleasure, pointing to God's gracious will in restoring his people. To truly fast as an act of worship is to participate in the Jubilee, to partner with Messiah in proclaiming liberty, restoration, and healing. When we fast, we are, in effect, raising the spiritual shofar, announcing to principalities and powers that the year of the Lord's favor has come. Our voices, lifted in prayer and fasting, echo the ancient blast that set the slaves free and restored what was lost. The preacher in the story learned that true preaching does not rest in eloquence, but in intercession. And effective intercession is not complete without biblical fasting, a posture of humility and hunger that magnifies our cry for God's breakthrough, as in Joel 2 and Isaiah 58. The power is not in delivery, but in the secret place, in wrestling, weeping between the porch and the altar, fasting, and proclaiming. Before standing before people, we must kneel before God, shofar in hand, ready to sound the announcement of Jubilee over our families, churches, and nations, allowing God to make us that well-watered garden. Fasting has always held a significant place in the history of God and his people, a sacred rhythm woven into the fabric of divine encounters and spiritual devotion. From Moses receiving the covenant on a fasted Mount Sinai, sustained for 40 days not by earthly bread but by the very word and breath of God, to Jesus confronting temptation in the wilderness after 40 days without food, and his first temptation had to do with food, fasting emerges not merely as abstinence, but as a profound response to God's presence. It is a preparation for holy work and a potent weapon in spiritual warfare, one of the weapons mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. Explore with me the foundational truths of fasting within the biblical narrative. It is not presented as a ritual for self-promotion or a means to earn religious merit, but rather as a divine invitation, a call into deeper dependence, intimacy, and unqualified surrender to the Almighty. Fasting is an act where we declare to the world, to angels, to ourselves, and to God that we cannot be sustained by this world. It has nothing for us. Christ, our example, modeled this discipline perfectly. He did not fast out of any spiritual deficiency concerning his divinity. Rather, he fasted as a means of aligning his human nature completely to the will of the Father subjugating his humanity, as it were. In doing so, he demonstrated fasting not just as an occasional practice, but as an essential component of a life wholly dedicated to worshiping and serving God, leaving a wonderful example for his church. His fast was a testament that true sustenance comes not from bread alone, but from every word proceeding from God's mouth, aligning his humanity with the Father's purposes. When questioned about food, he declared, "I'll have food to eat that you know nothing about. My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to accomplish his work." His humanity was spiritually sustained by denying his flesh, a spiritual sustainment the disciples did not yet understand. This denial of self, primarily associated with fasting, is the very path he invites us onto when he says, "Deny yourself and take up your cross daily." Jesus' specific teaching on fasting begins in a rather unexpected context, revealing its relational core. In Matthew 9 verse 15, when questioned why his disciples weren't fasting like the devout Pharisees or even the followers of John the Baptist, Jesus posed a counter-question. Can the sons of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? He continued, "But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then they will fast." With this, Jesus introduced a critical distinction. Fasting transcends mere religious duty. It is fundamentally a relational expression, deeply tied to his presence and absence. The sons of the bride chamber, according to historical Jewish custom, often called shoshbinim in Hebrew, were the intimate friends and companions of the bridegroom. Their role during the betrothal and week-long wedding festivities was crucial. They were there to celebrate, protect, and serve the bride and bridegroom. This is not to suggest that Jesus needed protection, but the bride did and does, in the strength of his might, assisting with feast organization, forming his entourage, contributing to the joyful atmosphere, and even serving as witnesses. As a side note, in the original text of the New Testament Greek, this word is where we get the word martyr. Their presence honored the groom. John the Baptist identified himself in this role, rejoicing greatly at the bridegroom's voice. By calling his disciples the sons of the bride chamber, Jesus not only identifies himself as the bridegroom, but also reframes fasting in the poignant light of love, longing, and devotion. It is the absence of the bridegroom that invokes fasting, not as a legalistic obligation, but as a response born from the ache of separation and a deep longing for his return. Thus, Christian fasting, rightly understood, is an expression of yearning for the presence of Christ, an expected practice after his ascension. This understanding places a profound responsibility on those who lead his church, his bride. Pastors and teachers, held to a higher accountability, must carefully consider their own devotion. Could the lack of spiritual power sometimes seen, perhaps replaced by psychological manipulation, stem from neglecting disciplines like fasting, thereby hindering leaders from being deeply connected to the fountainhead of living water and becoming springs whose waters do not fail? The call demands spiritual vigilance and dependence. The scriptures consistently warn against reducing fasting to an empty formality, a mere outward show devoid of inner transformation. In the scathing indictment of Isaiah 58, God rebukes a people whose fasting was superficial, leaving their hearts and actions unchanged. Is not this the fast I choose? He asks rhetorically, immediately calling instead for a fast that manifests in tangible acts of justice and mercy, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. This involves actively working against demonic oppression, the troubling of the mind. There are profound spiritual undertones here. The text implies that such fasting enables believers to become, in the strength of his might, repairers of the breach, actively participating in God's offensive against the enemy, snatching souls from darkness, plundering the enemy's goods, and expanding his kingdom. Biblical fasting is never merely about abstaining from food. It involves turning the whole heart toward God in humility, repentance, and active righteousness. God seeks surrender, not starvation. He desires hearts yielded to him, willing even to enter into the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his church. As Paul disciplined his body, we too are called to this path. Similarly, in Zechariah 7 verses 5 and 6, the Lord questions the motivation behind the people's fasting. When you fasted and mourned, was it really for me that you fasted? This exposes the peril of self-centered fasting. Fasting done merely to fulfill tradition, gain spiritual status, or appease a guilty conscience. Jesus' critique of the Pharisees in Matthew 6 echoes this concern. They fasted to be seen by men, seeking human approval rather than divine connection. How can one truly believe when seeking glory from others rather than the glory that comes from the only God? In stark contrast, God-honoring fasting is fundamentally God-centered. It is not a tool for manipulating God or impressing others, but a sincere act of worship, a declaration of dependence, and a means of aligning our lives with His justice and mercy. Notice the declaration of dependence. This is antithetical to what caused our fall. In His Sermon on the Mount, Jesus lays down the essential heart posture that must accompany true biblical fasting. When you fast, He instructs, do not be like the hypocrites, who disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Matthew 6. This passage underscores the core principle. The essence of fasting is its orientation unto God. It is intended as a hidden act of devotion, a private transaction between the individual soul and its Creator. The hypocrite fasts for human applause, seeking a fleeting reward from peers. The true disciple, however, fasts for divine communion, longing for the presence of the Father. The first approach cultivates only pride. The second cultivates intimacy with God. Fasting, therefore, is fundamentally an act of humility. It's a discipline that acknowledges our profound need for God, quiets the clamor of our fleshly desires, and positions us to hear His voice more clearly. It is in this posture of humility, this fertile soil, this humus, that God pours out His grace. Humility, understood as dependence on God and demonstrated through fasting, is the necessary condition for bearing genuine fruit.